Alrighty, sorry about the delay, folks. I am here now, and my prep work is basically set. Alright, welcome back to Story Time Saturdays. I will be your narrator today, and I am Fragath, in case nobody else is tuned in. Alright, I guess that will do it for intros. Let's go with the first one I've selected here, a shorty but a cutie. A couple short ones here and one slightly longer one. I'll see what I can fit in here, but we should be okay. There's three I definitely want to get to, and the other one would be nice, but if I can't swing it with the time I have available, so be it. So this first one is Zaritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. And it is from Galaxy Science Fiction of November 1951. So another fairly old one. That's what we've got a lot of. And there were entire serialized magazines of this stuff, each month having a number of short stories, and there were several magazines doing it at the same time. So there is a lot of material. Oh gosh, nigh on infinite, but so much of it has probably been lost to time now, which is a crying shame, really, since so much of it is so entertaining, at least to me. For those it is for. For those it is not entertaining for, well, I'm sorry, but Western civilization has created an unbelievable amount of fiction over the years. Unbelievable amount of fiction. And now there's probably even more of it being made, but it goes straight to insert reading tablet of your choice. It doesn't even wind up getting a physical publication, which I would think would make it much easier to lose things in the shuffle, if anything. But I don't know. I don't actually know the current state of the economics of book publishing. I should probably learn more about that and then deliver a speech next time. So, without further ado, Zaritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. Why bother building a time machine when there's something much easier to find right in your own kitchen? Somebody someday will make a study of the influence of animals on history. Although not as famous as Mrs. O'Leary's cow, Mrs. Graham's cat should certainly be included in any such study. It has now been definitely established that the experiences of this cat led to the idea of quick frozen people, which, in turn, led to the passage of Zaritsky's Law. We must go back to the files of the Los Angeles newspapers for 1950 to find the story. In brief, a Mrs. Fred C. Graham missed her pet cat on the same day that she put a good deal of food down in her home deep freeze unit. She suspected no connection between the two events. The cat was not to be found until 6 days later, when its owner went to fetch something from the deep freeze. Much as she loved her pet, we may imagine that she was more horror than grief-stricken at her discovery. She lifted the little ice-encased body out of the deep freeze and set it on the floor. Then she managed to run as far as the next-door neighbor's house before fainting. Mrs. Graham became hysterical after she was revived, and it was several hours before she could be quieted enough to persuade anybody that she hadn't made up the whole thing. She prevailed upon her neighbor to go back to the house with her. In front of the deep freeze, they found a small pool of water and a wet cat busily licking itself. The neighbor subsequently told reporters that the cat was concentrating its licking on one of its hind legs, where some ice still remained, so that she, for one, believed the story. A follow-up dispatch, published a week later, reported that the cat was unharmed by the adventure. Further, Mrs. Graham was quoted as saying that the cat had had a large meal just before its disappearance. That is soon after its rescue, as it had dried itself off, it took a long nap, precisely as it always did after a meal, and that it was not hungry again until evening. It was clear from the accounts that the life processes had been stopped dead in their tracks and had, after defrosting, resumed at exactly the point where they left off. Perhaps it is unfair to put all the responsibility on one luckless cat. Had such a thing happened anywhere else in the country, it would have been talked about, believed by a few, disbelieved by most, and forgotten. But as the historic kick of Mrs. O'Leary's cow achieved significance because of the time and place that it was delivered, so the falling of Mrs. Graham's cat into the deep freeze became significant because it occurred in Los Angeles. There, and probably only there, the event was anything but forgotten. The principles it revealed became the basis of a hugely successful business. How shall we, how shall we regard the Zaritsky brothers? As arch-villains or pioneers? In support of the latter view, it must be admitted that the spirit of inquiry and the willingness to risk the unknown were indisputably theirs. However, their pioneering, if we agree to call it that, was, equally indisputably, bound up with the quest for a fast buck. Some of their first clients paid as high as $15,000 for the initial freezing, and the exorbitant rate of $1,000 per year as a storage charge. The Zaritsky brothers owned and managed one of the largest quick freezing plants in the world, and it was their claim that converting the freezing equipment and storage facilities to accommodate humans was extremely expensive, hence the high rates. When the early clients who paid these rates were defrosted years later, and found other clients receiving the same services for as little as $3,000, they threatened a row, and the Zaritskys made substantial refunds. By that time, they could easily afford it, and since any publicity about their enterprise was unwelcome to them, all refunds were made without a whimper. $3,000 became the standard rate, with $100 per year the storage charge, and no charge for defrosting. The Zaritskys were businessmen, first and last. Anyone who had the fee could put himself away for whatever period of time he wished, and no questions asked. The ironclad rule that full payment must be made in advance was broken only once, as far as the records show. A certain young man had a very wealthy uncle residing in Milwaukee, whose heir he was, but the uncle was not getting along in years fast enough. The young man, then 18 years old, did not wish to waste the best years of his life as a poor boy. He wanted the money while he was young, but his uncle was as healthy as he was wealthy. The Zaritskys were the obvious answer to his problem. The agreement between them has been preserved. They undertook to service the youth without advance payment. They further undertook to watch the Milwaukee papers until the demise of the uncle should be reported, whereupon they would defrost the boy. In exchange for this, the youth, thinking of course that money would be no object when he came out, agreed to pay double. The uncle lived 17 years longer, during which time he seems to have forgotten his nephew and to have become deeply interested in a mystic society, to which he left his entire fortune. The Zaritskys duly defrosted the boy, and whether they or he were the more disappointed is impossible to imagine. They never forgot the lesson, and never made another exception to their rule. He, poor fellow, spent the rest of his life, including the best years, paying off his debt, which, at $3,000 plus 17 years at $100 per year, and the whole doubled, amounted to $9,400. The books record his slow but regular payments over the next 43 years and indicate that he had only $250 left to pay when he died. We may, I think, assume that various underworld characters who were grateful ex-clients of the Zaritskys were instrumental in persuading the boy to keep up his payments. Criminals were the first to apply for quick freezing and formed the mainstay of the Zaritskys' business through the years. What more easy than to rob, hide the loot, except for that all-important advance payment, present yourself to the Zaritskys, and remain in their admirable chambers for 5 or 10 years, emerge to find the hue and cry long since died down, and the crime forgotten, recover your haul, and live out your life in luxury? Due to the shady character of most of their patrons, the Zaritskys kept all records by a system of numbers. Names never appeared on the books, and anonymity was guaranteed. Law enforcement agents, looking for fugitives from justice, found no way to break down this system, nor any law which they could interpret as making it illegal to quick freeze. Perhaps the truth is that they did not search too diligently for a law that could be made to apply. As long as the Zaritskys kept things quiet and did not advertise or attract public attention, they could safely continue their bizarre business. City officials of Los Angeles, and particularly members of the police force, enjoyed a period of unparalleled prosperity. Lawyers and other experts who thought they were on the track of legal means by which to liquidate the Zaritsky Empire found themselves suddenly able to buy a ranch or a yacht or both, and retire forever from the arduous task of earning a living. Even with a goodly part of the population of Los Angeles as permanent pensioners, the Zaritsky fortune grew to incredible proportions. By the time the Zaritsky brothers died and left the business to their sons, it was a gold mine, and an inexhaustible one at that. During these later years, the enterprise began to attract a somewhat better class of people. Murderers and other criminals continued to furnish the bulk of the business, but as word of this amazing service seeped through the country, others began to see in it an easy way of solving their problems. They were encouraged, too, by the fact that the process was painless and the firm completely reliable. There were no risks, no accidents, no fatalities. One could, in short, have confidence in the Zaritskys. Soon after Monahan's great exposure rocked the nation, however, many of these better type clients leaped into print to tell their experiences. One of the most poignant stories came from the daughter of a Zaritsky client. Her father was still, at the age of 102, passionately interested in politics, but the chances of his lasting until the next election were not good. The daughter herself suggested the deep freeze, and he welcomed the idea. He decided on a 20-year stay because, in his own words, "If the Republicans can't get into the White House in 20 years, I give up." Upon his return, he found that his condition had not been fulfilled. His daughter described him as utterly baffled by the new world. He lived in it just a week before he left it, this time for good. She states his last words were, "How do you people stand it?" Some professional people patronized the Zaritskys, chiefly movie stars. After the expose, fan magazines were filled with accounts of how the stars had kept youthful. The more zealous ones had prolonged their screen lives for years by the simple expedient of storing themselves away between pictures. We may imagine the feelings of their public upon discovering that the seemingly eternal youth of their favorites was due to the Zaritskys, and not, as they had been led to believe, to expensive creams, lotions, diet, and exercise. There was a distinctly unfavorable reaction, and the letter columns of the fan magazines bristled with angry charges of cheating. But next to the criminals, the majority of people who applied for quick freezing seems to have been husbands or wives caught in unsupportable marital situations. Their experiences were subsequently written up in the confession magazines. It was usually the husband who fled to Los Angeles and incarcerated himself for an appropriate number of years, at the end of which time his unamiable spouse would have died or made other arrangements. If we can believe the magazines, this scheme worked out very well in most cases. There was, inevitably, one spiteful wife who divined her husband's intentions. By shrewd reasoning, she figured approximately the number of years he had chosen to be absent, and put herself away for a like period. In a TV dramatization rather pessimistically entitled, "You Can't Get Away," the husband described his sensations upon being defrosted after 15 years, only to find his wife waiting for him, right there in the reception room of the Zaritsky plant. "She was as perfectly preserved as I was," he said. "Every irritating habit that had made my life unbearable with her was absolutely intact." The sins of the fathers may be visited on the sons, but how often we see repeated the old familiar pattern of the sons destroying the life work of the fathers. The Zaritsky brothers were fanatically meticulous. They supervised every detail of their operations and kept their records with an elaborate system of checks and double checks. They were shrewd enough to realize that complete dependability was essential to their business. A satisfied Zaritsky client was a silent client. One dissatisfied client would be enough to blow the business apart. The sons, in their greed, overexpanded to the point where they could not, even among the four of them, personally supervise each and every detail. A fatal mistake was bound to occur sooner or later. When it did, the victim broadcast his grievance to the world. The story appeared in a national magazine, every copy of which was sold an hour after it appeared on the stands. Under the title, "They Put the Freeze on Me," John A. Monahan told his tragic tale. At the age of 37, he had fallen desperately in love with a girl of 16. She was immature and frivolous and wanted to play around a little more before she settled down. "She told me," he wrote, "to come back in 5 years, and that started me thinking. In 5 years I'd be 42, and what would a girl of 21 want with a man twice as old as her?" John Monahan moved in circles where the work of the Zaritskys was well known. Not only did he see an opportunity of being still only 37 when his darling reached 21, but he foresaw a painless way of passing the years which he must endure without her. Accordingly, he presented himself for the deep freeze, paid his $3,000 and the $500 storage charge in advance, and left. He claimed written instructions to let me out in 5 years, so there'd be no mistakes. Nobody knows how the slip happened, but somehow John A. Monahan, or rather the number assigned to him, was entered on the books for 25 years, instead of 5 years. Upon being defrosted and discovering that a quarter of a century had elapsed, his rage was awesome. Along with everything else, his love for his sweetheart had been perfectly preserved, but she had given up waiting for him and was a happy mother of 2 boys and 6 girls. Monahan's accusation that the Zaritskys had ruined his life may be taken with a grain of salt. He was still a young man, and the rumor that he received $100,000 for the magazine rights to his story was true. As most readers are aware, what has come to be known as Zaritsky's Law was passed by Congress and signed by the president 3 days after Monahan's story broke. 75 years after Mrs. Graham's cat fell into the freezer, it became the law of the land that the mandatory penalty for anyone applying quick freezing methods to any living thing, human or animal, was death. Also, all quick frozen people were to be defrosted immediately. Los Angeles papers reported that beginning on the day Monahan's story appeared, men by the thousands poured into the city. They continued to come, choking every available means of transport for the next 2 days. Until, that is, Zaritsky's Law went through. When we consider the date, and remember that due to the gravity of the international situation, a bill had just been passed drafting all men from 16 to 60, we realize why Congress had to act. The Zaritsky's, of course, were among the first to be taken. Because of their experience, they were put in charge of a military warehouse for dehydrated foods, and warned not to get any ideas for a new business. And that was Zaritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. Cute. When cryogenic entrepreneurism goes horribly, horribly, well, actually very, very right, but due to political pressures, such as, oh, a draft for a new war, things get a bit complicated. Alrighty. Here we go. I've got my next one here. Zoop. Come on, come on. I think I've read some by this person before. Here we go. Alright, so this next one is Atom Drive by Charles Fontenay. And it is from If Worlds of Science Fiction, April of 1956. I believe this is the tortoise and the hare one, sort of a race. Yeah, this is the one. This one's cute. Here we go. Atom Drive by Charles Fontenay. It was a race between the tortoise and the hare, but this hare was using some dirty tricks to make sure the ending would be different. The two spaceship crews were friendly enemies, sitting across the table from each other for their last meal before blastoff. Outside the ports, the sky was nothing but light-streaked blackness, punctured periodically by Earth glare, for Space Station 2 whirled swiftly on its axis, creating an artificial gravity. "Johnner, I figured you the last man to ever desert the rockets for a hot rod tow job," chided Russo Bott, captain of the Mars Corporation's gleaming new freighter, Marsward 18. Bott was fat and red-faced, and one of the shrewdest space captains in the business. Johnner Johns, at the other end of the table, inclined his grizzled head and smiled. "Times change, Russo," he answered quietly. "Even the Mars Corporation can't stop that." "Is it true you're pulling 5,000 tons of cargo, Captain?" asked one of the crewmen of the Marsward 18. "Something like that," agreed Johnner, and his smile broadened. "And I have only about twice the fuel supply you carry for a 100-ton payload." The communicator above them squawked and blared. "Captain Johns and Captain Bott of Martian Competition Run, please report to control for final briefing." "I knew it," grumbled Bott, getting heavily and reluctantly to his feet. "I haven't gotten to finish a meal on this blasted merry-go-round yet." In the space station's control section, Commander Ortega of the Space Control Commission and a CETIC officer in plain blues looked them up and down severely. "As you know, gentlemen," he said, "blastoff time is 0600. Tonnage of cargo, fuel, and empty vessels cannot be a factor under the law. The Mars Corporation will retain its exclusive franchise to the Earth-Mars run unless the ship sponsored by the Atom Star Company returns to Earth with full cargo at least 20 hours ahead of the ship sponsored by the Mars Corporation. Cargo must be unloaded at Mars and new cargo taken on. I do not consider the 20-hour bias in favor of the Mars Corporation a fair one, said Ortega severely, turning his gaze to Bott. But the Space Control Commission does not make the laws. It enforces them. Docking and docking and loading facilities will be available to both of you on an equal basis at Phobos and Marsport. Good luck. He shook hands with both of them. Saturn, I'm glad to get out of there, exclaimed Bott, mopping his brow as they left the control section. Every time I take a step, I feel like I'm falling on my face. It's because the control section's so close to the center, replied Johnner. The station's spinning to maintain artificial gravity, and your feet are away from the center. As long as you're standing upright, the pull is straight up and down to you, but actually your feet are moving faster than your head in a larger orbit. When you try to move, as in normal gravity, your body swings out of that line of pull and you nearly fall. The best corrective I've found is to lean backward slightly when you start to walk. As the two space captains walked back toward the wardroom together, Bott said, Johnner, I hear the Mars Corporation offered you the Marsward 18 for this run first, and you turned them down. Why? You piloted the Marsward 5 and the Wayward Lady for Mars Corp when those upstarts in the Argentine were trying to crack the Earth-Mars run. This Atom Star couldn't have enough money to buy you away from Mars Corp. No, Mars Corp offered me more, said Johnner, soberly now. But this atomic drive is the future of space travel, Russo. Mars Corp has it, but they're sitting on it, because they've got their fingers in hydrazine interests here, and the atom drive will make hydrazine useless for space fuel. Unless I can break the franchise for Atom Star, it may be 100 years before we switch to the atom drive in space. What the hell difference does that make to you? Asked Bott bluntly. Hydrazine's expensive, replied Johnner. Reaction mass isn't, and you use less of it. I was born on Mars, Russo. Mars is my home, and I don't want to see my people get the supplies they need from Earth and I want to see my people get the supplies they need from Earth at a reasonable transport cost, not pay through the nose for every packet of vegetable seed. They reached the wardroom door. Too bad I have to degrav my old chief, said Bott, chuckling. But I'm a rocket man myself, and I say to hell with your hot rod atom drive. I'm sorry you got deflected into this run, Johnner. You'll never break Mars Corp's orbit. The Marsward 18 was a huge vessel, the biggest the Mars Corporation ever had put into space. It was a collection of spheres and cylinders joined together by a network of steel ties. Nearly 90% of its weight was fuel for the one-way trip to Mars. Its competitor, the Radiant Hope, riding 10 miles away in orbit around the Earth, was the strangest looking vessel ever to get clearance from a space station. It looked like a tug towing a barge. The tug was the atomic power plant. 2 miles behind, attached by a thin cable, was the passenger compartment and cargo. On the control deck of the Radiant Hope, Johnner gripped a microphone and shouted profane instructions at the pilot of a squat ground-to-space rocket 20 miles away. Tan Lee Cho, the ship's engineer, was peering out the port at the speck of light toward which Johnner was directing his wrath, while Kopal, the Martian astrogator, worked at his charts on the other side of the deck. I thought all cargo was aboard, Johnner, said Tan. It is, said Johnner, laying the mic aside. That G-boat isn't hauling cargo. It's going with us. I'm not taking any chances on Mars Corp refusing to ferry our cargo back and forth at Mars. It is plotted, Johnner, boomed Kopal, turning his head to peer at them with huge eyes through the spidery tangle of his thin, double-jointed arms and legs. He reached an 8-foot arm across the deck and handed Johnner his figures. Johnner gave them to Tan. Figure out power for that one, Tan. ordered Johnner, and took his seat in the cushioned control chair. Tan pulled a slide rule from his tunic pocket, but his black almond eyes rested quizzically on Johnner. "It's 4 hours before blastoff," he reminded. "I've cleared power for this with space control," replied Johnner. "That planet-loving G-boat jockey missed orbit. We'll have to swing out a little and go to him." On a conventional spacecraft, the order for acceleration would have sent the engineer to the engine deck to watch his gauges and report by intercom. But the Radiant Hope's engine deck was the atomic tug 2 miles ahead, which Tan, in heavy armor, would enter only in emergencies. He calculated for a moment, then called softly to Johnner. "Pile 1 in 10." "In 10," confirmed Johnner, pulling a lever on the calibrated gauge of the radio control. "Pile 2 in 15." "In 15." "Check. I'll have the length of burst figured for you in a jiffy." A faint glow appeared around the atomic tug far ahead, and there was the faintest shiver in the ship. But after a moment, Copal said in a puzzled tone, "No G's, Johnner. Engine not work?" "Sure, she's working," said Johnner with a grin. "You'll never get any more G than we've got now, Copal, all the way to Mars. Our maximum acceleration will be 1/3000th G." "1/3000th?" exclaimed Tan, shaken out of his oriental calm. "Johnner, the Marsward will blast away at 1 or 2 Gs. How do you expect to beat that at 1/3000th?" "Because they have to cut off and coast most of the way in an elliptic orbit, like any other rocket," answered Johnner calmly. "We drive straight across the system, under power all the time. We accelerate halfway, decelerate the other half." "But 1/3000th?" "You'll be surprised what constant power can do. I know Bot, and I know the trick he's going to use. It's obvious from the blastoff time they arranged. He's going to tack off the moon and use his power right to cut 20 days off that regular 237-day schedule. But this tugboat will make it in 154 days. They took aboard the 200-ton landing boat. By the time they got it secured, the radio already was sounding warnings for blastoff. 0 hour arrived. Again, Johnner pulled levers, and again the faint glow appeared around the tail of their distant tug. Across space, the exhaust of the Marsward 18 flared into blinding flame. In a moment, it began to pull ahead visibly, and soon was receding like a meteor. Near the Radiant Hope, the space station seemed not to have changed position at all. "The race is not always to the swift," remarked Johnner philosophically. "And we're the tortoise," said Tan. "How about filling us in on this jaunt, Johnner?" "Is should, Johnner," agreed Copal. "Tan know all about crazy new engine. I know all about crazy new orbit. Both not know all. You tell." "I plan to, anyway," said Johnner. "I had figured on having Surge in on it, but he wouldn't understand much of it anyhow. There's no use waking him up." Surge was the ship's doctor-psychologist and fourth member of the crew. He was asleep on the center deck. "For your information, Copal," said Johnner, "the atomic engine produces electrical energy, which accelerates reaction mass. Actually, it's a crude ion engine. Tan can explain the details to you later, but the important thing is that the fuel is cheap, the fuel-to-cargo ratio is low, and constant acceleration is practical. As for you, Tan, I was surprised at your not understanding why we'll use low acceleration. To boost the engine power and give us more Gs, we'd either have to carry more fuel or coast part of the way on momentum, like an ordinary rocket. This way is more efficient, and our 63-day margin over the Marsward each way is more than enough for unloading and loading more cargo and fuel." "With those figures, I can't see how Marscorp expects to win this competition," said Tan. "We've got them flat on the basis of performance," agreed Johnner, "so we'll have to watch for tricks. I know Marscorp. That's why I arranged to take aboard that G-boat at the last minute. MarsCorp controls all the G-boats at Marsport, and they're smart enough to keep us from using them, in spite of the Space Control Commission. As for refueling for the return trip, we can knock a chunk off Phobos for reaction mass. The Meteor alarm bells clanged suddenly, and the screen lit up once with a fast-moving red line that traced the path of the approaching object. "Misses about half a mile," said Johnner after a glance at the screen. "Must be pretty big. And it's coming up!" He and Tan floated to one of the ports, and in a few moments saw the object speed by. "That's no meteor!" exclaimed Johnner with a puzzled frown. "That's man-made, but it's too small for a G-boat." The radio blared.
All craft in orbit near Space Station 2. Warning. All craft near Space Station 2. Experimental missile misfired from White Sands. Repeat. Experimental missile misfired from White Sands. Coordinates.
"Fine time to tell us," remarked Tan dryly. "Experimental missile, hell!" snorted Johnner, comprehension dawning. "Copal, what would have happened if we hadn't shifted orbit to take aboard that G-boat?" Copal. Oh, I've been saying his name wrong the entire time. I'm so sorry. It's Kokol. It's two Q's. For some reason, I was reading the other Q as a P. It's the font. Kokol calculated a moment. "Hit our engines," he announced. "Dead center." Johnner's blue eyes clouded ominously. "Looks like they're playing for keeps this time, boys." The Brotherhood of Spacemen is an exclusive club. Any captain, astrogator, or engineer is likely to be well known to his colleagues, either personally or by reputation. The ship's doctor psychologist is in a different category. Most of them sign on for a few runs for the adventure of it, as a means of getting back and forth between planets without paying the high cost of passage or to pick up even more money than they can get from the lucrative planet-bound's practice. Johnner did not know Surge, the Radiant Hope's doctor. Neither Tan nor Kokol had ever heard of him. But Surge appeared to know his business well enough, and was friendly enough. It was Surge's first trip, and he was very interested in the way the ship operated. He nosed into every corner of it and asked 100 questions a day. "You're as inquisitive as a cadet spaceman, Surge," Johnner told him on the 25th day out. Everybody knew everyone else well by then, which meant that Johnner and Kokol, who had served together before, had become acquainted with Tan and Surge. "There's a lot to see and learn about space, Captain," said Surge. He was a young fellow with fair hair and an easy grin. "Think I could go outside?" "If you keep a lifeline hooked on. The suits have magnetic shoes to hold you to the hull of the ship, but you can lose your footing." "Thanks," said Surge. He touched his hand to his forehead and left the control deck. Johnner, near the end of his 8-hour duty shift, watched the dials. The red light showing the inner airlock door was open blinked on. It blinked off, then the outer airlock indicator went on, then off. A shadow fell across Johnner briefly. He glanced at the port and reached for the microphone. "Careful and don't step on any of the ports," he warned Surge. "The magnetic soles won't hold on to them." "I'll be careful, sir," answered Surge. No one but a veteran spaceman would have noticed the faint quiver that ran through the ship, but Johnner felt it. Automatically, he swung his control chair and his eyes swept the bank of dials. At first, he saw nothing. The outer lock light blinked on, then off, then the inner lock indicator. That was Surge coming back inside. Then Johnner noted that the hand on one dial rested on 0. Above the dial was the word acceleration. His eyes snapped to the radio controls. The atomic pile levers were still at their proper calibration. The dials above them said the engines were working properly. The atomic tug was still accelerating, but passengers and cargo were in free fall. Swearing, Johnner jerked at the levers to pull out the piles aboard the tug. A blue flash flared across the control board, momentarily blinding him. Johnner recoiled, only his webbed safety belt preventing him from plummeting from the control chair. He swung back anxiously to the dials, brushing futilely at the spots that swam before his eyes. He breathed a sigh of relief. The radio controls had operated. The atomic engines had ceased firing. Tentatively, cautiously, he reversed the lever. There was no blue flash this time, but neither did the dials quiver. He swore. Something had burned out in the radio controls. He couldn't reverse the tug. He punched the general alarm button viciously, and the raucous clangor of the bell sounded through the confines of the ship. One by one, the other crew members popped up to the control deck from below. He turned the controls over to Kokol. "Take readings on that damn tug," Johnner ordered. "I think our cable broke. Tan, let's take a look outside." When they got outside, they found about a foot of the 1-inch cable still attached to the ship. The rest of it, drawn away by the tug before Johnner could cut acceleration, was out of sight. "Can it be welded, Tan?" "It can, but it'll take a while," replied the engineer slowly. "First, we'll have to reverse that tug and get the other end of that brake." "Damn, and the radio controls burned out. I tried to reverse it before I sounded the alarm. Tan, how fast can you get those controls repaired?" "Great space!" exclaimed Tan softly. "Without seeing it, I'd say at least 2 days, Jonna. Those controls are complicated as hell." They re-entered the ship. Kokol was working at his diagrams, and Serge was looking over his shoulder. Johnner took a heat gun quietly from the rack and pointed it at Serge. "You'll get below, mister," he commanded grimly. "You'll be handcuffed to your bunk from here on out." "Sir, I don't understand," stammered Serge. "Like hell you don't. You cut that cable," Johnner accused. Serge started to shrug, but he dropped his eyes. "They paid me," he said in a low tone. "They paid me 1,000 solars." "What good would 1,000 solars do you when you're dead, Serge? Dead of suffocation and drifting forever in space." Serge looked up in astonishment. "Why, you can still reach Earth by radio easily. It wouldn't take long for a rescue ship to reach us." "Chemical rockets have their limitations," said Johnner coldly. "And you don't realize what speed we've built up with steady acceleration. We'd head straight out of the system and nothing could intercept us if that tug had gotten too far before we noticed it was gone." He jabbed the white-faced doctor with the muzzle of the heat gun. "Get below," he ordered. "I'll turn you over to space control at Mars." When Serge had left the control deck, Johnner turned to the others. His face was grave. "That tug picked up speed before I could shut off the engines, after the cable was cut," he said. "It's moving away from us slowly and at a tangent, and solar gravity's acting on both bodies now. By the time we get those controls repaired, the drift may be such that we'll waste weeks maneuvering the tug back." I could jet out to the tug in a spacesuit before it gets too far away," said Tan thoughtfully. "But that wouldn't do any good. There's no way of controlling the engines at the tug. It has to be done by radio." "If we get out of this, remind me to recommend that atomic ships always carry a spare cable," said Johnner gloomily. "If we had one, we could splice them and hold the ship to the tug until the controls are repaired."
"Is cable in cargo strong enough, Johnner?" asked Kokol.
"That's right!" exclaimed Johnner, brightening. "Most of our cargo's cable. That 4,000-ton spool we're hauling back there is 6,000 miles of cable to lay a television network between the Martian cities." "Television cable?" repeated Tan doubtfully. "Will that be strong enough?" "It's bound in flotnite, that new fluorine compound. It's strong enough to tow this whole cargo at a couple of Gs. There's nothing aboard this ship that would cut a length off it. A heat gun at full power wouldn't even scorch it, but we can unwind enough of it and block the spool. It'll hold the ship to the tug until the controls can be repaired. Then we can reverse the tug and weld the cable." You mean the whole 6,000 miles of it's in one piece? Demanded Tan in astonishment. That's not so much. The cable-laying steamer Dominia carried 3,000 miles in one piece to lay Atlantic cables in the early 20th century. But how will we ever get 4,000 tons in one piece down to Mars? Asked Tan. No G-boat can carry that load. Johnner chuckled. Same way they got it up from Earth to the ship, he answered. They attached one end of it to a G-boat and sent it up to orbit, then wound it up on a fast winch. Since the G-boat will be decelerating to Mars, the unwinding will have to be slowed, or the cable would tangle itself all over Syrtis. Sounds like it's made to order, said Tan, grinning. I'll get into my spacesuit. You'll get to work on the radio controls, contradicted Johnner, getting up. That's something I can't do, and I can get into a spacesuit and haul a length of cable out to the tug. Coco can handle the winch. DeVitt, the Atom Star Company's representative at Mars City, and Kruger of the Space Control Commission, were waiting when the Radiant Hope's G-boat dropped down from the Phobos station and came to rest in a wash of jets. They rowed out to the G-boat together in a commission ground car. Johnner emerged from the G-boat, following the handcuffed Serge. He's all yours, Johnner told Kruger, gesturing at Serge. You have my radio reports on the cable cutting, and I'll make my log available to you. Kruger put his prisoner in the front seat of the ground car beside him, and Johnner climbed in the back seat with DeVitt. I brought the crates of dyes for the ground car factory down this time, Johnner told DeVitt. We'll bring down all the loose cargo before shooting the television cable down. While they're unloading the G-boat, I wish you'd get the tanks refilled with hydrazine and nitric acid. I've got enough to get back up, but not enough for a round trip. What do you plan to do? Asked DeVitt. He was a dark-skinned, long-faced man with a sardonic twist to his mouth. I've got to sign in on a new ship's doctor to replace Serge. When the Mars word comes in, Mars Corp will have a dozen G-boats working round the clock to unload and reload her. With only one G-boat, we've got to make every hour count. We still have reaction mass to pick up on Phobos. Right, agreed DeVitt. You can take the return cargo up in one load, though. It's just 20 tons of Martian relics for the Solar Museum. Mars to Earth cargoes run light. At the administration building, Johnner took his leave of DeVitt and went up to the Space Control Commission's personnel office on the second floor. He was in luck. On the board was applying for a Mars-Earth run as ship's doctor-psychologist was one name, Lana Eldon. He looked up the name in Mars City directory and dialed into the city from a nearby telephone booth. A woman's voice answered. Is Lana Eldon there? Asked Johnner. I'm Lana Eldon, she said. Johnner swore under his breath. A woman. But if she weren't qualified, her name would not have been on the commission board. The verbal contract was made quickly, and Johnner cut the commission monitor into the line to make it binding. That was done often when rival ships, even of the same line, were bidding for the services of crewmen. Blastoff time is 2100 tonight, he said, ending the interview. Be here. Johnner left the personnel office and walked down the hall. At the elevator, DeVitt and Kruger hurried out, almost colliding with him. Johnner, we've run into trouble, exclaimed DeVitt. Space Fuels won't sell us any hydrazine and nitric acid to refill the tanks. They say they have a new contract with Mars Corp that takes all their supply. Contract, hell, snorted Johnner. Mars Corp owns Space Fuels. What can be done about it, Kruger? Kruger shook his head. I'm all for you, but Space Control has no jurisdiction, he said. If a private firm wants to restrict its sales to a franchised line, there's nothing we can do about it. If you had a franchise, we could force them to allot fuel on the basis of cargo handled, since Space Fuels has a monopoly here. But you don't have a franchise yet. Johnner scratched his gray head thoughtfully. It was a serious situation. The atom-powered Radiant Hope could no more make a planetary landing than the chemically powered ships. Its power gave a low, sustained thrust that permitted it to accelerate constantly over long periods of time. To beat the powerful pull of gravity, of planetary surface gravity, the terrific burst of quick energy from the streamlined G-boats, the planetary landing craft, was needed. "We can still handle it," Johnner said at last. "With only 20 tons return cargo, we can make it up this trip. Add some large parachutes to that, DeVete. We'll shoot the end of the cable down by signal rocket, out in the lowlands, and stop the winch when we've made contact, long enough to attach the rest of the cargo to the cable. Pull it down with the cable, and, with Mars's low gravity, the parachutes will keep it from being damaged." But when Johnner got back to the landing field to check on unloading operations, his plan was smashed. As he approached the G-boat, a mechanic wearing an ill-concealed smirk came up to him. "Captain, looks like you sprung a leak in your fuel line," he said. "All your hydrazine's leaked out in the sand." Johnner swung from the waist and knocked the man flat. Then he turned on his heel and went back to the administration building to pay the 10-credit fine he would be assessed for assaulting a spaceport employee. The Space Control Commission's hearing room in Mars City was almost empty. The examiner sat on the bench, resting his chin on his hand as he listened to testimony. In the plaintiff's section sat Johnner, flanked by DeVete and Lana Eldon. In the defense box were the Mars Corporation attorney and Captain Russo Bott of the Marsward 18. Kruger, seated near the rear of the room, was the only spectator. The Mars Corporation attorney had succeeded in delaying the final hearing more than a 42-day Martian month by legal maneuvers. Meanwhile, the Marsward 18 had blasted down to Phobos, and G-boats had been shuttling back and forth, unloading the vessel and reloading it for the return trip to Earth. When testimony had been completed, the examiner shuffled through his papers. He put on his spectacles and peered over them at the litigants. "It is the ruling of this court," he said formally, "that the plaintiffs have not presented sufficient evidence to prove tampering with the fuel line of the G-boat of the spaceship Radiant Hope. There is no evidence that it was cut or burned, but only that it was broken. The court must remind the plaintiffs that this could have been done accidentally, through inept handling of cargo. Since the plaintiffs have not been able to prove their contention, this court of complaint has no alternative than to dismiss the case." The examiner arose and left the hearing room. Bott waddled across the aisle, puffing. "Too bad, Johnner," he said. "I don't like the stuff Marscorp's pulling, but I think you know I don't have anything to do with it. I want to win, but I want to win fair and square. If there's anything I can do to help—" "Haven't got a spare G-boat in your pocket, have you?" retorted Johnner, with a rueful smile. Bott pulled out his jowls. "The Marsward isn't carrying any G-boats," he said regretfully. "They all belong to the port, and Marscorp's got them so tied up you'll never get a sniff of one. But if you want to get back to your ship, Johnner, I can take you up to Phobos with me, as my guest." Johnner shook his head. "I figure on taking the Radiant Hope back to Earth," he said, "but I'm not blasting off without cargo until it's too late for me to beat you on the run." "You sure? This'll be my last ferry trip. The Marsward blasts off for Earth at 0300 tomorrow." "No thanks, Russo, but I will appreciate your taking my ship's doctor, Dr. Eldon, up to Phobos." "Done," agreed Bott. "Let's go, Dr. Eldon. The G-boat leaves Marsport in 2 hours." Johnner watched Bott puff away, with the slender, white-clad brunette at his side. Bott personally would see Lana Eldon safely aboard the Radiant Hope, even if it delayed his own blast-off. Morosely, he left the hearing room with DeVete. "What I can't understand," said the latter, "is why all this dirty work. Why didn't Marscorp just use one of their atom drive ships for the competition run?" "Because whatever ship is used on a competition run has to be kept in service on the franchised run," answered Johnner. "Marscorp has millions tied up in hydrazine interests, and they're more interested in keeping an atomic ship off this run than they are in a monopoly franchise." but they tie in together. If Marscorp loses the Monopoly franchise and Atom Star puts in Atom Drive ships, Marscorp will have to switch to Atom Drive to meet the competition. If we had a franchise, we could force Space Fuels to sell us hydrazine, said DeVete unhappily. Well, we don't, and at this rate, we'll never get one. Johnner and DeVete were fishing at the Mars City Recreation Center. It had been several weeks since the Marsward 18 blasted off to Earth with a full cargo. And still, the atomic ship Radiant Hope rested on Phobos with most of her Mars-bound cargo still aboard. And still, her crew languished at the Phobos space station. And still, Johnner moved back and forth between Mars City and Marsport daily, racking his brain for a solution that would not come. How in space do you get 20 tons of cargo up to an orbit 5,800 miles out without any rocket fuel? He demanded of DeVete more than once. He received no satisfactory answer. The recreation center was a 2-acre park that lay beneath the plastic dome of Mars City. Above them, they could see swift-moving Phobos and distant Deimos, among the other stars that powdered the night. In the park around them, colonists rode the amusement machines, canoed along the canal that twisted through the park, or sipped refreshment at scattered tables. A dozen or more sat, like Johnner and DeVete, around the edge of the tiny lake, fishing. DeVete's line tightened. He pulled in a streamlined flapping object from which the light glistened wetly. Good catch, complimented Johnner. That's worth a full credit. DeVete unhooked his catch and laid it on the bank beside him. It was a metal fish. Live fish were unknown on Mars. They paid for the privilege of fishing for a certain time, and any fish caught were sold back to the management at a fixed price, depending on size, to be put back into the lake. You're pretty good at it, said Johnner. That's your third tonight. It's all in the speed at which you reel in your line, explained DeVete. The fish move at preset speeds. They're made to turn and catch a hook that moves across their path at a slightly slower speed than they're swimming. The management changes the speeds once a week to keep the fishermen from getting too expert. You can't beat the management, chuckled Johnner. But if it's a matter of matching orbital speeds to make contact, I ought to do pretty well when I get the hang of it. He cocked an eye up toward the transparent dome. Phobos had moved across the sky into Capricorn since last he saw her. His memory automatically ticked off the satellite's orbital speed, 1.32 miles a second, speed in relation to planetary motion. Why go over all that again? One had to have fuel first. Meanwhile, the Radiant Hope lay idle on Phobos, and its crew whiled away the hours at the space station inside the moon, their feet spinning faster than their heads. No, that wasn't true on Phobos, because it didn't have a spin to impart artificial gravity, like the space stations around Earth. He sat up suddenly. DeVete looked at him in surprise. Johnner's lips moved silently for a moment. Then he got to his feet. Where can we use a radiophone? He asked. One in my office, said DeVete, standing up. Let's go, quick, before Phobos sets. They turned in their rods, DeVete collecting the credits for his fish, and left the recreation center. When they reached the Atom Star Company's Martian office, Johnner plugged in the radiophone and called the Phobos space station. He got Tan. All of you get aboard, Johnner ordered. Then have Kokol call me. He signed off and turned to DeVete. Can we charter a plane to haul our Earth-bound cargo out of Marsport? A plane? I suppose so. Where do you want to haul it in? Charax is as good as any other place, but I need a fast plane. I think we can get it. Marscorp still controls all the airlines, but the Mars government keeps a pretty strict finger on their planet-bound operations. They can't refuse a cargo haul without good reason. Just to play safe, have some friends of yours whom they don't know charter the plane in his name. They won't know it's us till we start loading the cargo. Right, said DeVete, picking up the telephone. I know just the man. Tow motors scuttled across the landing area at Marsport, shifting the cargo that had been destined for the Radiant Hope from the helpless G-boat to a jet cargo plane. Nearby, watching the operation, were Johnner and DeVete, with the Marsport agent of Mars Air Transport Company. "We didn't know Atom Star was the one chartering the plane until you ordered the G-boat cargo loaded on it," confessed the Mars Air agent. "I see you and Mr. DeVete are signed up to accompany the cargo. You'll have to rent suits for the trip. We have to play it safe, and there's always the possibility of a forced landing."
"There are a couple of spacesuits aboard the G-boat that we want to take along," said Johnner casually. "We'll just wear those instead."
"Okay." The agent spread his hands and shrugged. "Everybody at Marsport knows about you bucking Marscorp, Captain. What you expect to gain by transferring your cargo to Carax is beyond me, but it's your business." An hour later, the chartered airplane took off with a thunder of jets. Aboard was the 20-ton cargo the Radiant Hope was supposed to carry to Earth, plus some large parachutes. The Mars Air pilot wore a light suit with a plastic helmet, designed for survival in the thin, cold Martian air. Johnner and DeVete wore the bulkier spacesuits. 5 minutes out of Marsport, Johnner thrust the muzzle of a heat gun in the pilot's back.
"Set it on automatic, strap on your parachute, and bail out," he ordered. "We're taking over."
The pilot had no choice. He went through the plane's airlock and jumped, helped by a hearty boost from Johnner. His parachute blossomed out as he drifted toward the green Syrtis Major lowland. Johnner didn't worry about him. He knew the pilot's helmet radio would reach Marsport, and a helicopter would rescue him shortly.
"I don't know what you're trying to do, Johnner," said DeVete apprehensively over his space helmet radio, "but whatever it is, you better do it fast. They'll have every plane on Mars looking for us in half an hour." "Let 'em look, and keep quiet a while," retorted Johnner. "I've got some figuring to do."
He put the plane on automatic, took off the spacesuit handhooks, and scribbled figures on a scrap of paper. He tuned in the plane's radio and called Kokol on Phobos. They talked to each other briefly in Martian. The darker green line of a canal crossed the green lowland below them.
"Good, there's Drosinus," muttered Johnner. "Let's see, time 1424 hours, speed 660 miles an hour."
Johnner boosted the jets a bit and watched the terrain.
"By Saturn, I almost overran it," he exclaimed. "DeVete, smash out those ports."
"Break out the ports?" repeated DeVete. "That'll depressurize the cabin."
"That's right, so you'd better be sure your spacesuit's secure."
Obviously puzzled, DeVete strode up and down the cabin, knocking out its 6 windows with the handhooks of his spacesuit. Johnner maneuvered the plane gently and set it on automatic. He got out of the pilot's seat and strode to the right front port. Reaching through the broken window, he pulled in a section of cable that was trailing alongside. While the baffled DeVete watched, he reeled it in until he brought up the end of it, to which was attached a fish-shaped finned metal missile. Wow, say that 5 times fast. Johnner carried the cable end and the attached missile across the cabin and tossed it out the broken front port on the other side, swinging it so that the 700-mile-an-hour slipstream snapped it back in through the rearmost port like a bullet.
"Pick it up and pass it out through the right rear port," he commanded. "We'll have to pass it to each other from port to port. The slipstream won't let us swing it forward and through."
In a few moments, the two of them had worked the missile and the cable end to the right front port and in through it. Originating above the plane, it now made a loop through the 4 open ports. Johnner untied the missile and tied the end to the portion which came into the cabin, making a bowline knot out of the loop. DeVete picked up the missile from the floor where Johnner had thrown it. "Looks like a spent rocket shell," he commented.
"It's a signal rocket," said Johnner. "The flare trigger was disconnected."
He picked up the microphone and called the Radiant Hope on Phobos.
"We've hooked our fish, Kokol," he told the Martian,
and laid the mic aside. "What does that mean?" asked DeVete.
Means we better strap in, said Johnner, suiting the action to the words. You're in for a short trip to Phobos, Devete.
Johnner pulled back slowly on the elevator control, and the plane began a shallow climb. At 700 miles an hour, it began to attain a height at which its broad wings, broader than those of any terrestrial plane, would not support it.
I'm trying to decide, said Devete with forced calm, whether you've flipped your helmet. Nope, answered Johnner. Trolling for those fish in Mars City gave me the idea.
Trawling.
For those fish in Mars City gave me the idea. The rest was no more than astrogation problem, like any rendezvous with a ship in a fixed orbit, which Kokol could figure. Remember that 6,000-mile television cable the ship's hauling? Kokol just shot the end of it down to Mars' surface by signal rocket. We hooked on, and now he'll haul us up to Phobos. He's got the ship's engine hooked onto the cable winch.
The jets coughed and stopped. The plane was out of fuel. It was on momentum, to be drawn in by the cable, or to snap it and fall.
Impossible! Cried Devete in alarm. Phobos' orbital speed is more than a mile a second. No cable can take the sudden difference in that and the speed we're traveling. When the slack is gone, it'll break. The slack's gone already. You're thinking of the speed of Phobos, at Phobos. At this end of the cable, we're like the head of a man in the control section of a space station, which is traveling slower than his feet because its orbit is smaller, but it revolves around the center in the same time. Look, Johnner added, I'll put it in round numbers. Figure your cable as part of a radius of Phobos' orbit. Phobos travels at 1.32, but the other end of the radius travels at 0 because it's at the center. The cable end, at the Martian surface, travels at a speed between, roughly, 1,200 miles an hour. But it keeps up with Phobos' revolution. Since the surface of Mars itself rotates at 500 miles an hour, all I had to do was boost the plane up to 700 to match the speed of the cable end. That cable will haul a hell of a lot more than 20 tons, and that's all that's on it right now. By winching us up slowly, there'll never be too great a strain on it.
Devete looked apprehensively out of the port. The plane was hanging sideways now, and the distant Martian surface was straight out of the left-hand ports. The cable was holding.
We can make the trip to Earth 83 days faster than the Marswards, said Johnner, and they only have about 20 days start. It won't take us but a few days to make Phobos and get this cable and the rest of the cargo shot back to Mars. Atomstar will get its franchise, and you'll see all spaceships switching to the atomic drive within the next decade.
How about this plane? Asked Devete. We stole it, you know.
You can hire a G-boat to take it back to Marsport, said Johnner with a chuckle. Pay Mars Air for the time and the broken ports and settle out of court with that pilot we dropped. I don't think they'll send you to jail, Devete.
He was silent for a few minutes.
By the way, Devete, said Johnner then, radio Atomstar to buy some Flotnite cable of their own and ship it to Phobos. Damned if I don't think this is cheaper than G-boats.
And that was Atom Drive by Charles Fontenay. Slow and steady wins the race. All right. I think I only have time for one more. And that one more will have to be one by the venerable Philip K. Dick. It's a short one. Alrighty. And without further ado,
Oh, actually, what was the date on this one? See if I can find the original date. Planet Stories, July 1952. All right. Without further ado, Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. The slovenly wub might well have said, "Many men talk like philosophers and live like fools." They had almost finished with the loading. Outside stood the Optus, his arms folded, his face sunk in gloom. Captain Franco walked leisurely down the gangplank, grinning. "What's the matter?" he said. "You're getting paid for all this." The Optus said nothing. He turned away, collecting his robes. The captain put his boot on the hem of the robe. "Just a minute. Don't go off. I'm not finished." "Oh?" The Optus turned with dignity. "I am going back to the village." He looked toward the animals and birds being driven up the gangplank into the spaceship. "I must organize new hunts." Franco lit a cigarette. "Why not? You people can go out into the veldt and track it all down again. But when we run out halfway between Mars and Earth..." The Optus went off, wordless. Franco joined the first mate at the bottom of the gangplank. "How's it coming?" he asked. He said. He looked at his watch. "We got a good bargain here." The mate glanced at him sourly. "How do you explain that?" What's the matter with you? We needed more than they do." "I'll see you later, Captain." The mate threaded his way up the plank, between the long-legged Martian go-birds into the ship. Franco watched him disappear. He was starting up after him, up the plank toward the port, when he saw it. My God! He stood staring, his hands on his hips. Peterson was walking along the path, his face red, leading it by a string. "I'm sorry, Captain," he said, tugging at the string. Franco walked toward him. "What is it?" The wub stood sagging, its great body settling slowly. It was sitting down, its eyes half shut. A few flies buzzed about its flank, and it switched its tail. It sat. There was silence. "It's a wub," Peterson said. "I got it from a native for 50 cents. He said it was a very unusual animal, very respected." "This?" Franco poked the great sloping side of the wub. "It's a pig. A huge, dirty pig." "Yes, sir, it's a pig. The natives call it a wub." "A huge pig. It must weigh 400 pounds." Franco grabbed a tuft of the rough hair. The wub gasped. Its eyes opened, small and moist. Then its great mouth twitched. A tear rolled slowly down the wub's cheek and splashed on the floor. "Maybe it's good to eat?" Peterson said nervously. "We'll soon find out," Franco said. The wub survived the takeoff, sound asleep in the hold of the ship. When they were out in space and everything was running smoothly, Captain Franco bade his men fetch the wub upstairs so that he might perceive what manner of beast it was. The wub grunted and wheezed, squeezing up the passageway. "Come on," Jones grated, pulling at the rope. The wub twisted, rubbing its skin off on the smooth chrome walls. It burst into the anteroom, tumbling down in a heap. The men leaped up. "Good Lord," French said. "What is it?"
Peterson says it's a wub, Jones said. It belongs to him. He kicked at the wub. The wub stood up unsteadily, panting. What's the matter with it? French came over. Is it going to be sick? They watched. The wub rolled its eyes mournfully. It gazed around at the men. I think it's thirsty, Peterson said. He went to get some water. French shook his head. No wonder we had so much trouble taking off. I had to reset all my ballast calculations. Peterson came back with the water. The wub began to lap gratefully, splashing the men. Captain Franco appeared at the door. Let's have a look at it. He advanced, squinting critically. You got this for 50 cents? Yes, sir, Peterson said. It eats almost anything. I fed it on grain and it liked that. And then potatoes, and mash, and scraps from the table, and milk. It seems to enjoy eating. After it eats, it lies down and goes to sleep. I see, Captain Franco said. Now, as to its taste. That's the real question. I doubt if there's much point in fattening it up any more. It seems fat enough to me already. Where's the cook? I want him here. I want to find out. The wub stopped lapping and looked up at the captain. Really, Captain, the wub said, I suggest we talk of other matters. The room was silent. What was that? Franco said. Just now. The wub, sir, Peterson said. It spoke. They all looked at the wub. What did it say? What did it say? It suggested we talk about other things. Franco walked toward the wub. He went all around it, examining it from every side. Then he came back over and stood with the men. I wonder if there's a native inside it, he said thoughtfully. Maybe we should open it up and have a look. Oh, goodness, the wub cried. Is that all you people can think of, killing and cutting? Franco clenched his fists. Come out of there. Whoever you are, come out. Nothing stirred. The men stood together, their faces blank, staring at the wub. The wub swished its tail. It belched suddenly. I beg your pardon. I don't think there's anyone in there, Jones said in a low voice. They all looked at each other. The cook came in. You wanted me, Captain? He said. What's this thing? It's a wub, Franco said. It's to be eaten. Will you measure it and figure out... I think we should have a talk, the wub said. I'd like to discuss this with you, Captain, if I might. I can see that you and I do not agree on some basic issues. The captain took a long time to answer. The wub waited good-naturedly, licking the water from its jowls. Come into my office, the captain said at last. He turned and walked out of the room. The wub rose and padded after him. The men watched it go out. They heard it climbing the stairs. I wonder what the outcome will be, the cook said. Well, I'll be in the kitchen. Let me know as soon as you hear. Sure, Jones said. Sure. The wub eased itself down in the corner with a sigh. You must forgive me, it said. I'm afraid I'm addicted to various forms of relaxation. When one is as large as I... The captain nodded impatiently. He sat down at his desk and folded his hands. All right, he said. Let's get started. You're a wub. Is that correct? The wub shrugged. I suppose so. That's what they call us, the natives, I mean. We have our own term. And you speak English? You've been in contact with Earthmen before? No. Then how do you know it? Speak English? Am I speaking English? I'm not conscious of speaking anything in particular. I examined your mind. My mind? I studied the contents, especially the semantic warehouse, as I refer to it. I see, the captain said. Telepathy, of course. We are a very old race, the wub said. Very old and very ponderous. It is difficult for us to move around. You can appreciate that anything so slow and heavy would be at the mercy of more agile forms of life. There was no use in our relying on physical defenses. How could we win? Too heavy to run, too soft to fight, too good-natured to hunt for game. How do you live? Plants, vegetables. We can eat almost anything. We're very Catholic. Tolerant, eclectic, Catholic. We live and let live. That's how we've gotten along. The wub eyed the captain. And that is why I so violently objected to this business about having me boiled. I could see the image in your mind. Most of me in the frozen food locker, some of me in the kettle, a bit for your pet cat. So you read minds? The captain said. How interesting. Anything else? I mean, what else can you do along those lines? A few odds and ends, the wub said absently, staring around the room. A nice apartment you have here, Captain. You keep it quite neat. I respect life forms that are tidy. Some Martian birds are quite tidy. They throw things out of their nests and sweep them. Indeed, the captain nodded. But to get back to the problem. Quite so. You spoke of dining on me. The taste, I am told, is good. A little fatty, but tender. But how can any lasting contact be established between your people and mine if you resort to such barbaric attitudes? Eat me? Rather you should discuss questions with me. Philosophy, the arts. The captain stood up. Philosophy. It might interest you to know that we will be hard put to find something to eat for the next month. An unfortunate spoilage. I know, the wub nodded, but wouldn't it be more in accord with your principles of democracy if we all drew straws, or something along that line? After all, democracy is to protect the minority from such infringements. Now, if each of us casts one vote, the captain walked to the door. Nuts to you, he said. He opened the door. He opened his mouth. He stood, frozen, his mouth wide, his eyes staring, his fingers still on the knob. The wub watched him. Presently, it padded out of the room, edging past the captain. It went down the hall, deep in meditation. The room was quiet. So you see, the wub said, we have a common myth. Your mind contains many familiar myth symbols. Ishtar, Odysseus. Peterson sat silently, staring at the floor. He shifted in his chair. Go on, he said. Please, go on. I find in your Odysseus a figure common to the mythology of most self-conscious races. As I interpret it, Odysseus wanders as an individual, aware of himself as such. This is the idea of separation from family and country, the process of individuation. But Odysseus returns to his home. Peterson looked out the port window at the stars, endless stars, burning intently in the empty universe. Finally, he goes home. As must all creatures. The moment of separation is a temporary period, a brief journey of the soul. It begins, it ends. The wanderer returns to land and race. The door opened. The wub stopped, turning its great head. Captain Franco came into the room, the men behind him. They hesitated at the door. Are you all right? French said. Do you mean me? Peterson said, surprised. Why me? Franco lowered his gun. Come over here, he said to Peterson. Get up and come here. There was silence. Go ahead, the wub said. It doesn't matter. Peterson stood up. What for? It's an order. Peterson walked to the door. French caught his arm. What's going on? Peterson wrenched loose. What's the matter with you? Captain Franco moved toward the wub. The wub looked up from where it lay in the corner, pressed against the wall.
It is interesting, the wub said, that you are obsessed with the idea of eating me. I wonder why.
Get up, Franco said.
If you wish. The wub rose, grunting. Be patient. It is difficult for me.
It stood, gasping, its tongue lolling foolishly. Shoot it now, French said. For God's sake! Peterson exclaimed. Jones turned to him quickly, his eyes gray with fear.
You didn't see him, like a statue standing there, his mouth open. If we hadn't come down, he'd still be there.
Who? The captain? Peterson stared around. But he's all right now. They looked at the wub, standing in the middle of the room, its great chest rising and falling. Come on, Franco said. Out of the way. The men pulled aside toward the door.
You are quite afraid, aren't you? The wub said. Have I done anything to you? I am against the idea of hurting. All I've done is try to protect myself. Can you expect me to rush eagerly to my death? I am a sensible being, like yourselves. I was curious to see your ship, to learn about you. I suggested to the native.
The gun jerked. See, Franco said. I thought so. The wub settled down, panting. It put its paw out, pulling its tail around it.
It is very warm, the wub said. I understand that we are close to the jets. Atomic power. You have done many wonderful things with it, technically. Apparently, your scientific hierarchy is not equipped to solve moral, ethical.
Franco turned to the men, crowding behind him, wide-eyed, silent. I'll do it. You can watch. French nodded. Try to hit the brain. It's no good for eating. Don't hit the chest. If the ribcage shatters, we'll have to pick the bones out. Listen, Peterson said, licking his lips. Has it done anything? What harm has it done? I'm asking you. And anyhow, it's still mine. You have no right to shoot it. It doesn't belong to you. Franco raised his gun.
I'm going out,
Jones said, his face white and sick.
I don't want to see it.
Me too, French said. The men straggled out, murmuring. Peterson lingered at the door. It was talking to me about myths, he said. It wouldn't hurt anyone. He went outside. Franco walked toward the wub. The wub looked up slowly. It swallowed.
A very foolish thing, it said. I am sorry that you want to do it. There was a parable that your Savior related.
It stopped, staring at the gun.
Can you look me in the eye and do it? The wub said. Can you do that?
The captain gazed down. I can look you in the eye, he said. Back on the farm we had hogs, dirty razorback hogs. I can do it. Staring down at the wub into the gleaming, moist eyes, he pressed the trigger. The taste was excellent. They sat glumly around the table, some of them hardly eating at all. The only one who seemed to be enjoying himself was Captain Franco. More? He said, looking around. More? And some wine, perhaps.
Not me, French said. I think I'll go back to the chart room.
Me too. Jones stood up, pushing his chair back. I'll see you later. The captain watched them go. Some of the others excused themselves. What do you suppose the matter is? The captain said. He turned to Peterson. Peterson sat staring down at his plate, at the potatoes, the green peas, and at the thick slab of tender, warm meat. He opened his mouth. No sound came. The captain put his hand on Peterson's shoulder. "It's only organic matter now," he said. "The life essence is gone." He ate, spooning up the gravy with some bread. "I, myself, love to eat. It is one of the greatest things that a living creature can enjoy. Eating, resting, meditation, discussing things." Peterson nodded. Two more men got up and went out. The captain drank some water and sighed. "Well," he said, "I must say that this was a very enjoyable meal. All the reports I had heard were quite true. The taste of wub. Very fine. But I was prevented from enjoying this pleasure in times past." He dabbed at his lips with his napkin and leaned back in his chair. Peterson stared dejectedly at the table. The captain watched him intently. He leaned over. "Come, come," he said. "Cheer up. Let's discuss things." He smiled. "As I was saying before I was interrupted, the role of Odysseus in the myths—" Peterson jerked up, staring. "To go on," the captain said. "Odysseus, as I understand him—" And that was Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. I think that is some more implied cannibalism. I'm beginning to, as you've probably noticed, certain themes recur in these. I just realized I've still had the Media Source starting soon video on literally the entire time. Oh goodness, that's great. Well, preparation, lack thereof, rather. Wow, good job. So that's an hour and a half that I just totally muffed. I apologize. This is the image I had found that I wanted to use. Anybody who's tuned in this late now can see it. Sorry about that. Maybe I'll try and find time next week to do one. Next Saturday, I think I'm going to not be here, if I know my schedule correctly. And I'm going to be gone. Yeah, it's basically going to be 2 weeks. I'm going to be gone. But I should be back for the, yeah, I'll definitely be back for the one on the 27th. So I apologize for that. So I'll try and fit at least a short one in. I hope my audio was at least transmitting. Yeah, my audio was transmitting, but nothing else. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Maybe I can just edit this image statically onto the video. I don't know. In any event, you're probably noticing certain recurring themes. The general sexism of the era, for starters, and then, well, desperation, food, uh, cannibalism. It's that's shock value. What's the most horrifying thing you can think of? Oh, eating another human being. Usually, just about every single cultural taboo ever for the past over 2,000 years has basically included, yeah, eating people, kind of bad. There's some very good biological reasons to want to avoid eating people. Things like prions are a pretty good start. They tend to have pretty nasty after effects. In any event, thanks for tuning in if you tuned in. I'm sorry I still had the starting soon video playing the entire time and you couldn't see this artwork. So I apologize in retroactively for that. But yeah, I will still be able to do my Mecha Monday and Warframe Wednesday stream. Um, no, cat, don't step on the keyboard. Thank you, cat. So benevolent. Those will still happen next week, but I will be gone after Wednesday, and I will not be back until the week after. Um, I will try and put a notice up on the various social media type sites to indicate that this is occurring, and then I'll be back.
How rad is that?
All right, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you're enjoying these. And have a great day and a great weekend.